Part two of our FCA Christmas devotion series. Last time we talked about God's plan and how he used opposites and things that seem to defy logic to accomplish his plan. And so now, when you think about game, you've got game plan, and then you got to think about the players. You got to think about the personnel in the game. And so a verse that I think is illustrated well in what we're going to talk about today is Genesis 50:20, which says, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." And in context of that message, right, Joseph is able to save his brothers from a lot of problems, even though his brothers rejected him in a violent way. And God used that to go full circle for his good. And so I ask you this. Think back to one of your most memorable games you've ever played or coached in. What was significant about that game? I would venture to say that the opponent you were playing was a key part of that story. It wasn't just a matter of, we went out there and we played well. I'm sure it had something along the lines of, we're playing a team that hadn't been beaten, or we'd lost to them before, or they had this guy I didn't like, or whatever it may be. My best friend was on their team. I don't know. But the other team's a very important thing. Have you ever thought about that? How when you go into an athletic competition, the opponents, even though you're trying to defeat them, you can't have a game without them. Much the same way, God uses every detail in every team, every side to accomplish his will. So your opponent matters. And in this case, God uses his opponents to accomplish mighty things. In Luke chapter 2, we read about this man named Caesar Augustus, right? And he issues this tax, and you can read about that. Hopefully you've heard that already, but Luke chapter 2, if you don't know, go there and read. So we know about Mary and Joseph. We know they were people of noble character, and they decided to obey God no matter the circumstances and how bad it looked from the outside and how much judgment they would have incurred and the guilt or the ways that people probably thought of them. They decided to follow God, but God also used people like Caesar Augustus. So in Micah 5:2, the Bible tells us that Jesus is going to come out from Bethlehem, or he's going to be born in Bethlehem, actually. And so Bethlehem's this little town. It's called the City of David, and which is significant, of course, for many reasons as well. But Caesar Augustus, the only reason that Mary and Joseph are in Bethlehem to have Jesus was because Caesar Augustus issued a tax. Without that, they're not going. And when you think about birth, right, it's a moment. It's a day. It's not a multi-week festival. So the idea being that God orchestrated the very time and the very place through God's adversaries, the Roman government, in order to accomplish his will. And so God actually used the players on the other team to accomplish his will. Another example of that is King Herod. King Herod knew that this Messiah was coming. He had experts that were telling him this. He heard back that it was in Bethlehem, and so as a result of that, he actually slaughtered lots of young kids, lots of young boys, because he knew that the Messiah was to come out of that. What's really interesting, though, is in the Old Testament, God said that the Messiah would come out of Egypt. So when you see those two messages at the time, you think, he's got to come out of Egypt, but he's born in Bethlehem. How does that work? In God's economy, it's not a problem. So Jesus was born in Bethlehem. They flee to Egypt, and after Herod dies, they return from Egypt. He came out of Egypt. So we see that God orchestrates his plan through, obviously, the players on his team, but also the players that are opposing him. And so something to think about with that in practical application is there's no detail in your life that's void of purpose. If you go through a hard time, if you go through a struggle, there's a reason for it. There's a detail to be worked out. There's meaning behind it. It's not meaningless. It's not pointless. And so the other thing, just understanding, like, God uses everything. He coordinates everything and people in your life for just the right time to know you. And you'll talk about that whenever you read into the questions that are left. But my reflection question is this. Are you on God's team? Are you a player on his team, or are you on the other team? Do you want to be used by God in order to expand his kingdom, knowing him and loving him, or serving opposite him? So I just want to direct you to Romans chapter 10, verse 9 and 10. It says, if you openly declare that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is by believing in your heart that you are made right with God, and it is openly declaring your faith that you are saved. To join God's team, it's that simple. You believe in Jesus, you proclaim him as Lord, you obey what he says. That's it. And he'll set you free. And he'll give you his Holy Spirit, and he'll have you join his team. And he'll put you to work, like Mary and Joseph. So, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for joining us again for part 2.